Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, in the room and online. Thank you very much for joining us today for our very strategic event about security in East Asia. Let me first welcome our guest speakers. To my right is Mr. Christopher Johnstone. He's a managing principal of the Asia Group. And to his right is Mr. Abraham Denmark. He's senior advisor for the Asia Group. My name is Khaldoun Azhari. I'm a former president and currently first vice president and member of PAC committee who organized this very important event. Our guest speakers will talk about the situation in East Asia and the changes and the dynamics working there, especially between China, United States, and Japan, South Korea, Australia. There's shifting dynamics, and it seems like the region is moving toward more confrontation and less diplomacy to solve the increasing problems in this area. And especially in terms of military cooperation is increasing among the allies, Japan, United States, and South Korea, and Australia. Meanwhile, we can see clearly another alliance in formation being formed between Russia, North Korea, and with China from behind the curtains supporting that. And we will hear more about this and what are the expectations out of this dynamics here. And we have the speakers, they have a very important maybe notice to tell us about it. And we will have about 30 minutes, will be followed by Q&A. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome your guests. Thank you very much. Please start.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a great privilege to be here at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan, and I wanted to welcome and thank all of you for coming, and to the online audience as well. I'm Chris Johnstone, Managing Principal at the Asia Group, and what I'm going to try to do is provide a little bit of an outlook of the Trump administration's foreign policy and some of the geopolitical implications that may flow from it, including the implications for Japan. I think one point to make up front is that there are likely to be several, if not many, Trump foreign policies, not just one. And this reflects the reality that we saw in the first term of competing views among Trump's own staff related to some of the key issues in foreign policy, and then the relative unpredictability of Trump himself on some of these issues. So I think it's always important to be a little careful about describing what to expect, and particularly related to China policy, but nevertheless, I'll attempt to give you a broad picture. First, let me start with a quick review of the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific and beyond, just to sort of set the stage here. Like the first Trump administration, Biden described China as the central challenge facing the United States. The Biden administration's national security strategy described the PRC, China, as the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. So China, front and center. And the Biden administration's strategy when it came to China was summarized in a speech that Tony Blinken gave in 2022, invest, align, and compete. That was kind of the mantra. And what that meant was investments at home in critical technologies through things like the CHIPS Act, deeper cooperation with allies, so the alignment piece, and then compete, aggressive actions to compete with China in the economic and technology space. Another core principle of the Biden administration was this idea of shaping China by shaping the environment around China through intensified work with allies and partners globally to set the environment around China and therefore guide its behavior. And it did so by promoting cooperation, including minilateral cooperation, new groupings of countries working together, U.S., Japan, South Korea, U.S., Japan, Australia, collectively building what DoD called integrated deterrence, right? This was the approach. Economically, the Biden administration pursued targeted actions to limit China's access to advanced technologies in some critical areas with military application. So it was a policy of what I would call kind of targeted decoupling, what Jake Sullivan described as the small yard and the high fence, right? You restrict China's access to technology in a few key areas. But the idea was that they would be targeted within a small yard with a very high fence. More to say about all of that, but that was the Biden administration's broad approach. And they also brought, of course, as you know, a deep skepticism about free trade agreements, right? I think early on there was some thought that maybe the Biden administration would bring the United States back into the CPTPP. He, of course, did not do so. So this economic policy that I just described was in the context of continued reluctance to do multilateral trade agreements. So how is Trump different? Trump also, of course, places China at the center of strategy. Trump also has the view that China seeks to replace the United States as the leading world power, uses subsidies, intellectual property theft, unfair trade practices to try to overcome, surpass U.S. economic power. And in many of those big picture ways, I think the Biden administration and his team would agree. Not such a different sort of philosophical frame. But I think the tools and the scope of the strategy are going to be very different. As many of you know, Trump talks about pursuing a much broader decoupling of the U.S. economy from the Chinese economy. He has promised sweeping tariffs, 60% on imports, 200% on electric vehicles, tariffs perhaps on Mexico to prevent Chinese products from entering through Mexico. He's talked about taking away China's permanent normal trading relationship status with the United States, which would be a very significant step. So the economic tools are much blunter and broader. Trump also brings less focus on working with allies and partners to shape China, so that shaping agenda, I think, will be less of a feature. In his first term, he was very focused on unilateral action, U.S. action alone, bilateral engagement, in other words, U.S. engaging directly with another partner, where the Trump view traditionally has been U.S. leverage is strongest, and a very transactional approach. As many of you know, he brings a deep skepticism about allies, has tended to view them as free riders who have often taken advantage of the United States. So we can expect a policy that's focused on pressing allies to do much more. And you may even see some conditioning of American commitments based on allied willingness to step up. He's basically said this to NATO. Now, there are caveats here, right? This is where personalities will matter. The who's on Trump's team will matter a lot. It's likely, I think, we're going to see that the team is composed of people with very different views on some of these questions. So on the one hand, we have Vice President Vance, likely Secretary of State Rubio, likely National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, strong China hawks, conservative, pro-alliance, right? So you have a constellation of people in that space. But then you're going to also have players like Elon Musk. And I think the press reporting over the last week or so demonstrates that he's likely to have a pretty significant role with Trump on a wide variety of issues, including foreign policy. So this mix, I think, introduces the possibility of fluctuation in policy toward China in interesting ways. So I think, one fundamental question, right, is what is the purpose of these tariffs? Is the purpose of the tariffs to decouple the U.S. economy from the Chinese economy, or is the purpose of the tariffs to set the terms of a negotiation, ultimately a negotiation with China over economic exchange? I think that's a key question to ask and to watch, and we may see different players playing differently on that. What else can we say about Trump's foreign policy, and what will it mean for allies? I think, as I suggested, I think you'll see less focus on building the multilateral cooperation, more focus on bilateral engagement. Broadly speaking, I think we can expect Trump to sustain pressure on Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, others to increase defense spending and to play a larger role in sustaining deterrence. Japan is in the midst of an historic defense buildup, of course, to 2% of GDP. I would expect the Trump administration will will communicate that that's not enough. Former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper spoke at the Mount Fuji Dialogue over the weekend, and his message was Japan should anticipate pressure to increase defense spending to 3% of GDP. So more of this is coming. On South Korea, you may recall that in the first Trump administration, in addition to pursuing direct dialogue with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Trump also ended military exercises essentially between the United States and South Korea and began a discussion inside the U.S. government about withdrawals of U.S. forces from the Korean Peninsula. I think we have to assume that that's also a conversation that could return. And then when you think about Taiwan, on the one hand, the first Trump administration was strongly supportive of Taiwan with large arms sale packages, elevated diplomatic engagement, increased displays of military support for Taiwan. So you had that part of the picture on the one hand. On the other hand, Trump has also expressed frustration with Taiwan's defense spending, questioned the importance of Taiwan to the United States, complained about Taiwan, as he put it, taking away the U.S. semiconductor industry. So there are these different strains, and I think we're likely to see both on display as the Trump administration takes office. So finally, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Abe Denmark, how will the region and the world react to this new American leadership? As we like to say, the other side gets a vote, right? So I think that you're likely to see a number of reactions. First, on China, I think China will almost certainly retaliate against the tariffs that if Trump in fact moves forward with imposing them. Likely to impose restrictions on exports of critical materials, perhaps using their own sanctions measures on U.S. entities. China has more legal tools available to it to do so. But at the same time, I think we can anticipate that Beijing will also seek to find ways to bring the Trump administration to the negotiating table, to signal a willingness to talk about a new trade agreement. And you'll recall that the Phase 1 trade agreement in the first Trump administration was of course, the administration imposed tariffs, but they also ultimately resulted in a negotiation, and I think the Chinese are likely to seek to pursue a similar outcome. China will also seek to undo the minilateral cooperation that has been such a feature of the Biden administration's policy, likely to seek to divide Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia, possibly by offering separate inducements, separate incentives related to trade and investment to attempt to divide the progress that's been made. And I think we're also likely to see from China an early test of the administration's commitment on Taiwan and perhaps on the South China Sea through, for example, another large-scale military exercise, increased military activity around Taiwan. China will be very interested in testing the level of Trump administration support for Taiwan. On Russia, won't surprise you, I think we can expect efforts to weaken solidarity in Europe and undermine NATO, and also I think weaken Japanese and South Korean support for Ukraine as well, to try to return the Ukraine issue to one that is centered in Europe and not global in nature. I think North Korea, we may see an effort on the part of Kim Jong-un to signal a willingness to engage in dialogue again. There has been no dialogue at all between the United States and North Korea for the entirety of the Biden administration. I think we might see the possibility, at least, of North Korea signaling a willingness to talk, again aimed at dividing the United States from its key allies in the region. And then finally, I think allies and partners of the United States are likely to demonstrate a range of responses to Trump 2.0. Some will move to increase defense spending. We already see this in Taiwan, where there are clear indications from the Lai government of plans to increase defense spending rather significantly. We see other partners signaling plans to announce major initial gestures like purchases of commercial aircraft. So I think you're going to see some of that. But you also see across Asia and in Europe partners looking for ways to hedge and to protect their own interests particularly in the economic relationship with China. And I think that's kind of my bottom line here at the end. The Biden administration attempted to forge something of a unified, or at least a coordinated approach on economic strategy toward China across the G7 and with major U.S. partners. I think you're likely to see much more fragmentation among the G7 and among other partners as countries focus on how they protect their own commercial interests. So we have the prospect of a more fragmented West, if you will, in dealing with the China challenge. I don't want to be too categorical in all this, given some of the fluctuations we're likely to see, but I do think some of those broad features are likely to pertain. Let me stop there and hand it over to my colleague, Abe Denmark.
Okay. Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for having us. It's a real pleasure to be with you, to be in Tokyo. It's been several years since I've been in Tokyo. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and to share ideas with my old friend and colleague, Chris Johnstone. So I'd like to follow up on his comments by giving my views on the implications of President Trump's return to the White House and what it means for American foreign policy, what it means for Japan. I clearly can't speak for the incoming Trump team. I am not part of that team, but this is my sense of where they are and how things may transpire going forward. But I wanted to start with a key point, which is talking about the distinctions between the world that Trump will be seeing coming into office this time as opposed to when he left 4 years ago. Because I think he's going to see a world that's changed pretty significantly, both in some ways for better and for worse. In terms of worse, obviously the ongoing war in Ukraine and in the Middle East is an issue that he campaigned on a lot, talked about that he would solve these issues very quickly. I believe he said that he would solve the Ukraine war before he entered into the White House. So we'll see how that goes. But obviously he's going to look to settle those quickly, maybe not in ways that many of us would like to see, but those are obviously major challenges he's going to face that is going to have major implications for us in the Indo-Pacific. But there are also some positive changes since he left. NATO is larger and I think more unified, far more unified than when he left, and really united in purpose in its defense of Europe and its support for Ukraine. We also can see China and Russia expressing a lot of confidence, expressing a lot of power, but significantly challenged at home. In China, because of its economic challenges, Russia, because of both its economic challenges and what has so far been a significant strategic defeat that it's experienced so far in Ukraine. And in the Indo-Pacific, President Trump will find a much stronger, more robust lattice work of relationships in the Indo-Pacific between the United States and its allies and partners, which is a tremendous asset for the United States and something that, if we're looking at competing successfully with China, is a tremendous advantage for the United States. So looking at the issues that are going to be impacted by President Trump's coming back to the White House, I wanted to make four broad points. First, on security and defense issues. I think, especially when it comes to Japan, many of the key initiatives that have taken place that I think the Biden administration should get a lot of credit for moving forward in terms of posture, a realignment, the USFJ reconstitution, all of those I expect will continue. Those are not terribly controversial in the U.S. system and something that's very much beneficial to us, so I expect those will continue. But that said, I think we're going to be facing significant challenges in our defense relationship and our alliance. Specifically, one issue that Chris already mentioned, defense spending, a new expectation of Japan spending 3% of its GDP on defense is something that I would expect to come to not only to Japan, but to most, if not all, of America's allies and partners. So I expect that to be discussed in NATO, with Japan, with Korea, with Taiwan, and with some of those countries perhaps even going beyond 3%. But that is something that I expect will be coming fairly quickly. And we also know that in Japan, we're going to be going through another round of host nation support negotiations that will need to be concluded in 2026. And I expect that will be a much more difficult, complicated negotiation than previous iterations that I've been a part of, that Chris has been a part of, than we've seen before, especially seeing expectations for much higher levels of support from Japan into the United States in terms of host nation support. I also expect one of the key pieces of our lattice work of alliances and partnerships relationships that's going to have seen reduced support from the United States is the trilateral relationship between the United States, Japan, and Korea, which from what I've seen is just not a priority for the Trump team. And so I'll be looking to see if that relationship can continue to make progress, but that initiative is really going to have to come from Tokyo and Seoul, is my expectation going forward, which is unfortunate, but my hope is that we'll be able to continue to move that incredibly important relationship forward. Chris mentioned the possibility of another effort by the United States under Trump to reduce or remove U.S. military presence in Korea. I agree there's a good likelihood of that, but I wanted to add a wrinkle to this, is that in addition to the other changes in the geopolitical situation that we've seen before, he'll find Kim Jong-un in a much different political position than when he left. Kim Jong-un has a much stronger relationship with Putin. North Korea has a much stronger relationship with Russia, and that gives Kim many more options. It gives the United States less leverage over North Korea than we had in the past because they have that stronger relationship with Russia. So while Trump may be anxious to restart that relationship and begin engagements with DPRK on a similar note of where we were before, perhaps more letters forthcoming, I expect that he'll find Kim Jong-un to be much less enthusiastic about those relationships, although I do expect there to be some effort at engagement for a while. And finally, there is an expectation that the Trump administration will be more confrontational with China, especially on the economic front, and I'll get to that in a minute. But on the defense and security side, this is going to be very dependent on the team that Trump brings in. As I will talk about in a bit, I expect that the Trump team will initially be very much more focused on domestic issues, even when it comes to the military and the Department of Defense. And I expect that we'll see, as we saw a lot in the first Trump administration, is that a lot of the confrontational approaches with China will be largely rhetorical, in that they may say a lot of tough things. They may talk about how China is the primary challenge or the pacing challenge or whatever term they may use. But we may also recall it's been reported that President Trump did not decide to push China when it came to Hong Kong or Xinjiang or a lot of other issues that he just decided were not in American interest to push or comment upon. So I'll be seeing how the team comes together, how the staff comes together, and whether, to echo what Chris was saying, whether the approach is more traditional or more transactional in how they go forward. The second broad point I'd like to make very quickly is about AUKUS. I was a senior advisor for AUKUS to the Secretary of Defense for a couple of years, so this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I actually expect AUKUS is going to continue in the Trump administration. There's significant bipartisan support for AUKUS, especially in Pillar 1 that is moving forward ahead. And I do expect there's a lot of good opportunities for Pillar 2 to move forward, including bringing Japan on board into Pillar 2. Japan brings a tremendous amount of capability and capacity to the table when it comes to AUKUS Pillar 2, especially in areas like AI, uncrewed systems, and quantum. So very excited to see that moving forward and building on what we accomplished during the Biden administration on quantum. On economics, I think the significant implications of what the Trump administration is envisioning for the United States is going to have tremendous implications for Japan. We all know about the tariff pieces, 10%, 20% on all imports, high rates on China and potential on Mexico, both of which will have significant implications for Japan, especially your automotive industry, and leading to a weaker yen. So as we're thinking about Japan spending 3% of GDP on defense, that's also going to be in the context of a yen that might be getting weaker, so those extra yen are buying less and less, so it's going to be even more difficult to get to those thresholds for the Japanese government. So this is something that I'm watching very closely. It will also have significant implications for supply chains, leading to reconfiguration of supply chains, disruptions of supply chains, because China is such an important role in this, including for many Japanese SMEs that supply components into China and into Mexico as well and other countries, really just reconfiguring what supply chains look like, which could lead to significant disruptions. President Trump has mentioned his efforts his goals to scale back some of the Inflation Reduction Act, which will cause significant changes to business models related to EVs and batteries, which of course are very important in the Japanese economy, and a politicized CFIUS process. I know you all saw what happened with Nippon Steel. I expect that will continue. Those sorts of developments will continue going forward. The last point I'd like to make, and this is building off of what Chris was saying, is on the implications of political instability and domestic focus in the United States. If you look at President Trump and what he campaigned on and what his defense team has been focusing on, it's very domestically centered. But that doesn't mean Japan, the Indo-Pacific, will not be affected by this. For example, President-elect Trump has expressed his desire to expel the roughly 20 million undocumented workers and people living in the United States. An operation of that scale will require, in my estimation, use of the National Guard in the U.S. Army to move people at that scale and at that speed. That's going to mean significant outlays of money and use of forces that would otherwise be focused on international security issues. So that's going to have an effect on the broader defense enterprise in the United States, let alone the second-order political effects that one could expect that would happen, that such an effort would happen in the United States, driving to more protests and other things happening in the United States. Second, President Trump's ambitions to slash the bureaucracy, to shrink the size of the U.S. administrative state through a non-governmental agency providing recommendations run by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Those sorts of broad, significant slashes to bureaucracy, I think, while there's certainly room to cut and room to reform U.S. government processes, there's no doubt there, but doing so in an untargeted, unconsidered way will lead to a drastically less responsive system. So for a country like Japan, just thinking in the defense circle, looking at arms sales, looking for more investment, looking for the government to process these sorts of things, I think we can expect a less responsive system, a more chaotic system going forward. And finally, Ukraine and the Middle East, going back to those pieces. We've had successive governments in the United States expressing an intention to focus on the Indo-Pacific, from the pivot in the Obama administration to the first Trump administration's effort on a free and open Indo-Pacific to the Biden administration's focus on the Indo-Pacific as well. With the Trump administration focused on resolving conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, does that allow for more actual focus and investment on the Indo-Pacific and China? Or will the team be so focused on resolving those issues that the Indo-Pacific inevitably takes a back seat? I don't know how that last piece plays out. But I do know that focusing on the Indo-Pacific, having seen this in the Obama administration and in the Biden administration, focusing on the Indo-Pacific requires highly disciplined processes and highly disciplined leaders who can cut out time in their day to say, I know there's these other crises going on, but we're going to spend time talking about China, talking about our alliances, and talking about the Indo-Pacific. Requires highly disciplined leaders and processes. And from what I've seen, President Trump is not a highly disciplined process guy. And so I'll be watching very closely to see how a Trump administration is able to carve out time and ensure that the Indo-Pacific gets the attention and resources that it needs, even while the United States continues to address the challenges that it faces at home and in Europe and in the Middle East. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very informative insights. It's very useful for us journalists because we like to talk about the future, near future. I would like to open the floor to question and answers. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand and proceed to the first mic. Nishimura-san.
Thank you very much today. My name is Takuya Nishimura, freelance journalist. Prime Minister Ishiba had a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and in that conference, they reconfirmed the basic principle between Japan and China, which is mutually beneficial relationship based on strategic interests. So it looks like the bilateral relationship is improving, but if the China restart the import from Japanese products like sea products, China can be hedging from United States to Japan. So how do you think that Trump administration, President-elect Trump is seeing this development of bilateral relationship between Japan and China? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The first point I would make is I think it's a welcome thing that Japan and China's bilateral relationship is stabilizing. Certainly that's something the United States sought over the last year itself in the bilateral relationship, is to achieve a more stable equilibrium. I think the question to ask, and the question I think Japanese officials involved in foreign policy are thinking about is, does this represent a change in Chinese strategy toward a higher priority on the relationship with Japan, or is it a tactical adjustment that reflects something else? My interpretation would be, as I tried to say in my remarks, I think it's likely that Beijing is going to try to use the new approach of the Trump administration to seek to divide U.S. allies and partners, right? To weaken this lattice work that Abe Denmark mentioned, that Biden has been focused on building. So if that's the goal, it's not surprising to me at all that Beijing would offer a relatively friendly meeting with Prime Minister Ishiba. The question is whether that's accompanied by real action, things like allowing imports of seafood again from the, in other words, moving beyond the Fukushima water issue. Is there a reduction in Chinese vessels around the Senkaku Islands? Does China become more cooperative on issues that Japan cares about, like the North Korea problem? My guess is that the answer to all those things is probably no. And that what we're seeing is a tactical adjustment aimed at this, a first step in seeking to promote division among the U.S., Japan, South Korea, Australia. I don't think it's going to work, but that would be my interpretation of what's happening.
As usual, Chris Johnstone answered it perfectly, and I have nothing else to add.
The answer is no, basically. Thank you. I have a question online from Rocky Swift from Reuters News. He's asking, it was announced yesterday that Japanese troops would begin regular deployment to Australia to train with US and the Australian forces there. What's your view on that and how it fits into the overall Asian security sphere? Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll take that one first. I think it's such an important development and such a critical development in the Indo-Pacific, broadly speaking. I think this is part of a broader dynamic that we've seen in the Indo-Pacific in the last few years, is building out from a hub and spoke model that the United States typically had in the Indo-Pacific, where the United States was at the center and had a lot of bilateral relationships, to building more critical, more effective relationships between America's allies and partners. So this agreement, which we've seen coming down the road for a while now, the training of Japanese forces in Australia, the training of Australian forces in Japan, the stronger relationships between Japan and Australia is such a welcome development, I think. And it's the building of this lattice work that I mentioned before of relationships that I think is going to bring greater stability to the Indo-Pacific. It's of tremendous geopolitical value, tremendous security value to both those countries and to the rest of the region, including the United States. So it's something I'm very supportive of, and I think the forces will become stronger because of their ability to operate with one another, their familiarity with one another. And it's another example of these relationships, be it US-Japan, Australia, US-Japan, Philippines, the Quad, AUKUS, all of these relationships are coming together to build a region that is more stable, where the relationships are more robust. And I think that, for the Biden administration, was part of their strategy to shape the environment in which China is emerging, and ideally shape their perceptions of how to engage with the region and reduce its more confrontational approach to foreign affairs and security issues than we'd seen in the past.
Thanks. Any question? Okay, let me ask a question. I heard Trump saying many times, I was the only president who didn't launch wars, during my mission. During my presidency, there were no wars. And as you said, he wants to solve the wars in Ukraine and Middle East in one day or something like that. But at the same time, he pressures his allies to spend more on defense. So don't you think this is a little bit contradictory? Like, if you don't want wars, you should spend less on defense and more on diplomacy, and try to have kind of peaceful agreements with countries. Do you have any comment on his ability to stop wars, and why he's emphasizing and pressuring other countries to spend more on defense? Thank you.
So it's a good question. I think what I would say is I think the Trump view is that, to try to sort of, I think, capture the philosophy behind it, is that obviously deterrence is a part of how you keep the peace, but I think the Trump view would be that the United States shouldn't be carrying most of the burden in sustaining deterrence, that allies should step up and do more as part of that effort. And I think, frankly, a lot of Americans would agree fundamentally with that message. I think for me, the question is, of course, I'm skeptical that you can quickly bring to an end the war in Ukraine and the wars in the Middle East. That you can quickly bring them to an end, and particularly quickly bring them to an end in a way that really reflects an outcome that's best for U.S. interests. I think where I see difference in the Biden view from the Trump view is, Trump and his team have made clear that their view is the United States should prioritize the Indo-Pacific and therefore shift attention and resources away from Europe and focus on the Indo-Pacific. I think the Biden view was you can't do that, that the conflict in Europe is ultimately linked to the prospects for peace in East Asia, and that defeating Putin in Ukraine is part of how you deter Xi in using violence against Taiwan. So I think that's an important difference. And frankly, my own view is more closely aligned with the Biden administration on this. But I think that's a fundamental difference, is can you separate these theaters, or are they more connected in a way that makes it difficult to practice deterrence in one and ignore the other?
Yeah, building off of that, I think President Trump has been very clear in his view that alliances are fundamentally unfair to the United States, in that the United States is paying a lot of money to defend allies that don't pay to defend themselves, or don't pay enough to defend themselves. So I expect his approach to the war in Ukraine is to say the United States is going to stop subsidizing Ukraine's defense, and that should be Europe's job, and call on the NATO countries to spend more to support Ukraine. that the United States would still potentially sell arms to Ukraine, but that we would not subsidize it, that those funds would have to come from the Europeans themselves, and that Europe would need to spend more money to defend itself. Similarly, I think he's expressed a very clear view that countries in Asia have been able to develop and become wealthy over the decades because the United States is footing the bill for their defense. And he sees that as fundamentally unfair. And I think that's where his comments about Taiwan and their industries, their growing industries, especially with semiconductors and chip manufacturing, comes into play. That in his view, Taiwan has been able to become a leader in those fields because the United States has been bankrolling their defense. And he sees that as fundamentally unfair. That's not to say that Trump will necessarily abrogate its defense commitments, but rather say that the United States expects these countries to pay more to defend themselves. He often sees it as a fee that they're paying to the United States, even though that's not what it is. But I do think that he will often see these things as interlinked. The other point I'd make is that he does not necessarily see deterrence against China or confronting China as incompatible with degrading, diminishing the importance of alliances and partnerships. I think he sees these as separate issues. And fundamentally, he sees all of these as parts of negotiations and more business-like transactions rather than interlinked geopolitical dynamics. And so that's why I think he can, on one hand, say we need to be tougher on the Chinese and confront them, while on the other hand, diminishing the effectiveness, diminishing the importance of our alliances and partnerships.
Thank you very much. Please.
Alex Wilson with Stars and the Stripes. So just to your point that you were just making, does rapidly changing or even just progressively changing these relationships, such as the U.S., South Korean, Japanese alliance, or calling on allies to foot more of the bill when it comes to defense spending, all of that could be either a rapid or a slight shift in the power in the region. Does that create a power vacuum? Does that, China has been very aggressive, obviously, in the past couple decades, but very much so recently. Does that create kind of an opportunity for China to seize? How do you see this playing out kind of long term?
Sure. Yeah, I think it, broadly speaking, and it's of course going to differ country by country, but broadly speaking, if the United States pulls back from the region, I fully expect China will try to fill that gap. And as the United States diminishes its relationships, as Chris was saying, I expect China to try to drive wedges in between these relationships. I think it's going to have some greater success with some relationships than others. Frankly, I think the U.S.-Japan alliance is so robust and so fundamentally built into how both countries operate that it's going to be very difficult to unwind. And I don't think President Trump is looking to unwind it. I think there's a bit of a different story in Korea, where President Trump has in the past expressed an interest in removing troops from Korea, and where I think China has a bit more of an open door to try to build up its relationship and try to drive those wedges. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, I think China has some opportunities to drive wedges there, where if the United States were to not engage or to bring back its engagement in the region. But that said, every country in the region, for the most part, is not looking for bad relations with either country, right? Even in countries where there is a negative relationship with China or a confrontational relationship with China, be it Japan, Taiwan, whatever it may be, Australia, there has been efforts to stabilize these relationships, to stabilize the relationship with China. and to not fully fall off a cliff in terms of those relationships. So I expect countries to continue to hedge for the most part and try to maintain as robust a relationship they can with the United States while trying to muddle through with China. The key question to me is less about the United States, frankly. The United States is going to do its thing, and the United States in 4 years will have another election, and we'll see what happens, and countries can kind of try to wait it out if they're not happy with how Trump is going. To me, the key question is China. It's been widely reported that Xi Jinping has identified 2027 as the date when the PLA should be ready to take Taiwan by force. That doesn't mean that they will try to do that, but it does, I think, signify that the potential for conflict in East Asia, if not high, is a very real possibility that we cannot ignore. And so to me, the question is, how aggressive is China going to be in trying to drive these wedges? As these countries countries in the Indo-Pacific try to build stronger relationships with China, more stable relationships with China, how aggressively does Beijing try to use those relationships as leverage and pressure these countries to diminish their engagement with the United States, to undermine this lattice work, and to give China greater space and flexibility in the region? I don't know how aggressive China is going to be, but that's certainly something I'm going to be watching going forward.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure. I think, I guess the one observation that I would have to build on, I think, Abe's very good points. I think we should assume that the Trump administration will move forward pretty aggressively with the imposition of tariffs on China. I mean, there may be, you can imagine different approaches. Maybe there's a phasing. Maybe there's a period of time before they introduce them. But I would anticipate pretty rapid movement on the tariff front toward China. That's going to put other countries in the region, friends of the United States, in a potentially difficult situation that China will seek to take advantage of by perhaps offering separate trade market access arrangements in an effort to peel off other allies and partners from the U.S. approach. So I think this whole question of how the region responds to a much more aggressive U.S. trade policy toward China is a key thing to watch.
Thank you. Shimura-san again.
Takuya Nishimura again. Thank you very much. North Korea is enhancing its relationship with Russia, resuming the security treaty. And what do you think the Trump administration's response to that relationship or security arrangement? Is it dialogue or confrontation?
Excellent question. I think the first point I would make is, the alignment between North Korea and Russia and the apparent alliance that the two have now is one of the most concerning developments in the region in a long time. And I think, frankly, it sometimes doesn't get enough attention. The decision by North Korea to send thousands of troops to Ukraine to support directly combat in the invasion of Ukraine is an astonishing step. So it's important to recognize the significance of this challenge to security. And as you said, the degree to which Kim Jong-un is likely emboldened by the fact that in addition to China, he now has another ally, a close ally in the region. And I think the truth is that we don't know how the Trump administration is going to respond to this. I would anticipate an effort on the part of the Trump administration to resume dialogue with North Korea. The Biden administration actually tried for 4 years to get dialogue going with North Korea. The North Koreans refused. And I think they refused in part because they realized they weren't going to get material benefits from a negotiation. they may be interested in seeing what they can get from Trump in terms of, for example, less military activity between the United States and South Korea. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some at least exploration of diplomatic engagement between the two. I tend to agree with Abe that it's unlikely to produce much because North Korea will believe that its position is pretty strong. But I think that's likely to be a dynamic early on.
All I'd add to that is my assessment is that the main driver of North Korea's engagement with Russia has been to give itself greater space vis-a-vis China, to diminish its reliance on China and ensure that it has more political, economic, and military backing rather than just being entirely dependent on Beijing, which I think so far has succeeded for Pyongyang. So as we think about North Korea's willingness to engage the United States, I would think about it in terms of the material benefits that it gets, but also what kind of political benefits it gets in terms of increasing its own strategic autonomy and diminishing its geopolitical and economic reliance on China and now Russia as well.
Thank you. All right. If I may ask about Prime Minister Ishiba, he said something about Asia and NATO. Although it's not very clear, it's vague, but I think it's very important in his mind. And he also said that Japan should be like equal to the United States in their relationship. And he also wanted SOFA agreement with the American forces to be amended or something. So do you think he has different views on military alliance than other prime ministers? And do you think if he becomes if his government becomes more stable and he's more powerful, he will be more aggressive on having different, a little bit military policies and strategy with America? Thank you.
Yeah. Again, great questions. I think what I would say on this, I think the fact that the Prime Minister advocates and has given thought to the possibility of an Asian NATO is positive in the sense that it suggests that Japan places a lot of value on closer security ties with its neighbors, right? That for Japan, Japan's ties should be about more than just the United States, that it also needs South Korea, Australia, others, the Philippines. And I think that's positive, and I think welcome. Now, my own view is that the prospect of a formal treaty structure like a NATO in Asia is a long way off in the future. Probably not realistic anytime soon. But there is this interesting set of developments over the last several years that Abe has talked about, the deepening lattice work, this steadily building informal cooperation, US, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, steadily becoming more and more meaningful, like the training initiatives announced in Australia, the information sharing between Japan and the ROK, the exercises with the Philippines, steadily becoming more meaningful, so and therefore contributing to security and deterrence in the region, right? And so I think that is the most practical path forward, is turning this informal cooperation that is slowly becoming more concrete and more real, and moving down the direction toward more formal structures, but in the meantime doing meaningful work together. I think that's the most practical way forward. On SOFA, what I would say is I think some of his ideas that have been expressed, for example, increasing training opportunities for the self-defense force in the United States, in Guam, these are good ideas. I think that would those sorts of ideas would help to build further interoperability between the U.S. military and the Japanese military. I don't think you need to revise the SOFA to do those things. But I think the ideas themselves, particularly one about self-defense force training in the United States, is an idea worth considering.
I extend the session a little bit because we started late, so I have one more question if you like. All right. I have a question for Mr. Abraham. I can't help but I ask it. It's for the market to decide, but I want to ask you because you talked about the economic aspects. You said the dollar will, the yen will be weaker. Yeah. And I took note of this. And why do you think the yen will be weaker? And how much do the dollar you expect this? Of course, this question is not for strategists like you, but I'm wondering, do you have any insights on this?
Well, I think I think the expectation is that President Trump is going to strengthen the U.S. dollar through the tariffs, the tax cuts, regulatory reform, the other pieces that he's announced his intentions to do, which I think will inherently have implication in terms of weakening the yen further. Having spoken with folks engaging in Japan's defense budget issues, I understand that a weakening yen already makes it even more difficult to get to the spending marks that you're looking to get to, makes it even more expensive to get what you're needing out of the SDF. And so I see that as further complicating efforts to get to 2% and beyond, should the Trump administration start talking about 3% of GDP. I think it becomes increasingly difficult for Japan to get there, especially when thinking about Japanese households being affected by a weaker yen and having to navigate those things. So it's something to watch. I don't have a definitive prediction about how weak it will get and when. I think the Trump administration will have to get legislation passed, it'll have to get implemented, so it'll take time for this to go through, but it is definitely an issue that I'll be watching as a defense specialist, especially seeing its implications for the ability of Japan and our other allies to increase their own defense expenditures and how it affects their broader economics relationship with the United States.
My name is Ken Moskowitz, and I'm a freelancer, and I teach U.S. foreign policy at Temple University, Japan. For Mr. Denmark, I'm curious, when you mentioned that AUKUS will continue, what conception do you have of the shape or the leadership in AUKUS and the Quad if, as Trump indicates, there'll be less U.S. participation? Will other countries step up and show leadership? Thank you.
So first, a very important point. Not related to any of this, but my mother's maiden name is Moskowitz, so I'm very excited. We got to start talking about these relationships. On your question, I think the Quad and AUKUS have the best prospects to go through the Trump administration relatively unscathed. When it comes to the Quad, you may recall that it was actually the Trump administration that began to upgrade the Quad, first bringing it to a foreign minister's level. And it was the Biden administration that built on the work of the Trump administration to bring that to the summit level. So they clearly saw value in that, in the Quad relationship. I expect a lot of that is because of the importance that they put on relations with Japan and with India. So I expect that the Quad will continue to advance forward. Though what specific initiatives, how it plays out, I think remains to be seen. In terms of AUKUS, I spent, in my previous role in the Department of Defense, I spent hours upon hours talking about AUKUS with members of Congress, both Democratic and Republican. My team saw that I took more than 50 trips to Capitol Hill in a year. And the end result was a portion of the National Defense Authorization Act that was passed with bipartisan support. And AUKUS was specifically got a lot of support from both Democrats and Republicans. And many of the people that I expect will go into staff a Trump team have made very positive comments about AUKUS going forward. I think Pillar 1 is already such an important part of how the US and Australia and the UK envision their future submarine force, that it's pretty endemic to that. So it's pretty built in to that going forward. Pillar 2, I think, has more variability, in part because it's just smaller than what we have with Pillar 2. But I do think that many in the incoming Trump team will see the potential the promise of Pillar 2 and the importance of bringing Japan into some of those Pillar 2 projects. So I do expect that will go forward, and but again, what specifically how that plays out is really remains to be seen.
What's the last question?
Okay.
Very simple. The more sanctions applied on North Korea, the more advanced their missiles and military technology is achieved. So how can we explain that? And do you think the West and Japan should exchange sanctions with diplomacy to solve the problem with North Korea? Or do you think the sanctions are ineffective at all, basically?
Cheryl, sorry. So I think obviously sanctions depend on enforcement, and one of the biggest challenges that we have faced in recent years has been the breakdown of Chinese and Russian support for those sanctions. It used to be that the United Nations Security Council was a reasonably effective venue for coordinating measures against North Korea, and that has largely disappeared now that we're in an environment in which China and Russia essentially won't cooperate. Look, my view is that at the end of the day, we have to continue to impose these sanctions measures on North Korea. We need to be realistic about efficacy. And so therefore, deterrence becomes a really critical means of dealing with this challenge. And that means a robust U.S. military posture in the region. It means closer cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. It means working with other partners, including NATO. And I think it means ultimately, from my own point of view, degrading the Russian-North Korea relationship by continuing to support the defense of Ukraine and demonstrating that North Korea's contribution to that conflict has not been successful. So bottom line is, I think deterrence is while we continue to pursue sanctions, deterrence needs to be the central part of keeping peace in Northeast Asia.
Thank you very much. I think this wraps up our event today. Mr. Christopher Johnstone, Managing Director, Managing Principal of the Asia Group, thank you so much for your insights, and also Mr. Abraham Denmark, Senior Advisor, Asia Group, the Asia Group. Thank you very much for coming here and giving us a lot of homework to work on. And ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to our guest at the end of this event. Thank you. Have a nice evening.